I didn't make a single sound when my son-in-law stood up at my 70th birthday party and told the room he was taking over my company. Not one word. I just looked at him, really looked at him, and I thought about the envelope sitting in the inside pocket of my blazer, the one my attorney had handed me that morning, the one I'd been carrying like a stone against my chest all day waiting. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. My name is Robert Callahan. I'm 70 years old, and I built Callahan Woodcraft from a single-bay garage in Akron, Ohio, into a regional manufacturing company with 63 employees and contracts with furniture distributors across 14 states. I did it with my hands, my back, and 38 years of showing up before anyone else and leaving after the last light went out. My wife, Patricia, God rest her, used to joke that I was married to that building before I was married to her. She wasn't entirely wrong, but she also knew what that building meant. She knew I was building something we could leave behind, something that would outlast us both. Patricia passed 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We didn't even have time to be angry about it. After she was gone, it was just me and my daughter, Elise. Elise is 34. She has her mother's eyes and her mother's laugh and, unfortunately for her, my stubbornness. She works in marketing, good at her job, sharp in ways I'm not. She met her husband Colton at a conference in Columbus about 3 years ago. He was in commercial real estate, or said he was. He had smooth hands and a smoother tongue. And the first time he shook mine, I remember thinking, this man has never built anything with those hands. Not once in his life. I didn't say that to Elise. You don't say things like that to your daughter when she's glowing the way she was glowing. You smile, you shake the hand, you watch. I watched. The first loan request came 8 months into their relationship. Not from Elise's, from Colton, directly to me, over a cup of coffee at my kitchen table like we were old friends. He needed a short-term bridge loan, he said, a real estate deal that was about to close, a liquidity timing issue, $60,000, back in 90 days with interest. I wrote him the check. Not because I trusted him, because I loved my daughter, and I knew refusing would create a wound between us that would never fully close. I wrote the check, and I told myself it was the price of keeping the peace. He paid it back in 93 days. I didn't say anything about the 3 days. The second request came 14 months later, just after he and Elise got engaged. $120,000 this time. Another bridge loan. Another deal about to close. I asked more questions. He had answers for all of them. Smooth answers. Polished. The kind of answers that come from a man who has spent a long time learning how to say things without actually saying anything. I wrote the second check. Elise never knew about either one. I made sure of that. I didn't want her carrying the weight of it. And honestly, I didn't want her knowing that her father wasn't entirely sure about the man she was going to marry. The wedding was beautiful. We held it at a restored farmhouse venue outside of Medina, about 40 minutes south of Akron. Elise wore her mother's pearl earrings. I walked her down the aisle and I was fine. I held myself together, just fine, until we got to the end and I lifted her veil and she whispered, "I wish Mom was here." And then I was not fine at all. I kissed her forehead and I walked back to my seat and I sat down and I breathed. That was 18 months ago. The birthday party was my daughter's idea. 70 is a milestone, she said. We're doing this properly. She reserved the private room at Dunleavy's Steakhouse on South Main, the place Patricia and I used to go for anniversaries. She invited about 40 people, my shop foreman, a few longtime friends, my brother Ted and his wife, some neighbors. It was supposed to be a celebration, prime rib and good bourbon and the people I'd spent my life building something alongside. I got there early, the way I always do. I shook hands. I hugged people. My shop foreman, a man named Al who has worked for me for 22 years, gave me a card signed by the whole floor crew. I had to look at the ceiling for a moment after I read it. Colton arrived with Elise about 20 minutes in. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my first truck. He ordered a round of drinks for the table. The expensive stuff, the kind of generosity that costs nothing when you're spending someone else's goodwill. And he worked the room the way a man works, a room when he's been practicing it for years. Backslapping, laughing too loud, finding reasons to mention numbers. I watched him from across the room and I felt it, that low, cold feeling in my gut that had been there since the first time he shook my hand. I had learned by then not to argue with that feeling. Dinner was served. There were toasts. Ted gave one that made everyone laugh and made me want to cry, knowing Patricia should have been there to hear it. Elise gave one that was so perfectly her, funny and warm and slightly embarrassing, that I laughed until my chest hurt. Then Colton stood up. I assumed it was another toast. People were raising their glasses. He waited until the room was quiet, that practiced pause of his, and then he said, "I want to take a moment tonight to talk about the future of Callahan Woodcraft." I set down my glass. The room shifted. A few people glanced at each other. Al, sitting 3 seats down from me, went very still. "Robert has built something incredible," Colton said, and he smiled at me, and it was the most hollow thing I'd ever seen on a human face. 38 years, 63 employees, a real legacy. And I think we can all agree that at 70, it's time to start thinking about what that legacy looks like going forward. I didn't speak. "Elise and I have been talking," he said, "and we believe the right move for the company, for the family, for everyone in this room, is a formal transition of operational leadership, effective immediately." Someone at the far end of the table made a sound. I couldn't tell if it was a laugh or a gasp. My brother Ted had both hands flat on the table, like he was steadying himself. "What I'm proposing," Colton said, and he pulled a folder from somewhere. He brought a folder to my birthday dinner. He'd come prepared, he'd planned this, is that Robert steps back into a founder's advisory role and that I assume primary operational authority over Callahan Woodcraft, with the formal transfer of controlling interest to be completed within 60 days. The room was completely silent. I looked at my daughter. Elise was staring at her plate. Her jaw was tight. Her hands were in her lap. She was not looking at me, and that told me something. That told me a great deal. "Robert," Colton said, looking directly at me now, "I think you know this makes sense. You've been carrying this alone for a long time. Let us help carry it." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I reached into the inside pocket of my blazer. The envelope was exactly where I'd put it that morning. Cream-colored, heavy stock, the return address of my attorney's office printed in the upper left corner. I'd been carrying it since 9:30 that morning, when my attorney, a woman named Janet, who has handled my affairs for 16 years, handed it to me in her office and said, "I think you should keep this close today." Janet knew about Colton. She'd known for 4 months. I set the envelope on the table in front of me. I didn't open it yet. I just rested my hand on top of it. "Colton," I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected, and somehow that made it worse for him, I think. Quiet is harder to argue with than loud. "How much do you know about the structure of Callahan Woodcraft?" He blinked. "Enough to." "Do you know what an irrevocable family trust is?" A pause. "Of course." "Do you know when Callahan Woodcraft was placed into one?" The pause this time was different. Something moved behind his eyes. "Because it was placed into an irrevocable family trust," I said, 14 years ago, drafted by Janet Morse of Morse & Associates here in Akron, witnessed and notarized and filed with the state of Ohio. The trust names my daughter Elise as the sole beneficiary upon my death or voluntary transfer. There is no mechanism in that document for a controlling interest to be transferred to a spouse. There is no mechanism for an outside party to assume operational authority. The trust was designed specifically to prevent exactly what you described tonight. The color had started leaving his face somewhere around the word irrevocable. Furthermore, I said, and I opened the envelope now, slowly, because I had the time. 4 days ago, Janet received a copy of a filing from the Ohio Secretary of State's office, a filing in which a company called Westbrook Capital Partners, LLC, which I am informed is registered to your name and 2 other individuals, attempted to initiate a transfer claim on 40% of Callahan Woodcraft's assets based on what was characterized as an outstanding personal debt obligation. I laid the document on the table and smoothed it flat with my palm. That filing, I said, references the 2 loans I made to you personally. It attempts to reclassify those personal loans as business investments in Callahan Woodcraft and claims a corresponding equity stake. That is not what those loans were. That is not what you represented them to be when you asked for them. And what you have attempted to do with this filing is called fraudulent misrepresentation, and it carries significant civil and criminal exposure in the state of Ohio. Colton had both hands on the table now. His face was doing something I had never seen a face do before, cycling through expressions too fast for any one of them to land. Robert, Janet filed an injunction against the transfer claim this morning, I said. She also contacted the Ohio Attorney General's office. They were quite interested. I picked up the envelope and tucked it back into my blazer. The folder you brought tonight, Colton. I'd recommend you speak to an attorney before you share that with anyone else. The room was so quiet I could hear the kitchen noise through the wall. I looked down the table at Al, who was staring at me with an expression I can only describe as a man who has just watched something he has always believed in be confirmed. I looked at my brother, who had both hands over his mouth. I looked at 40 people who had come to celebrate something and had instead witnessed something else entirely. Then I looked at my daughter. Elise was crying, quietly, the way her mother used to cry, like she was trying not to let anyone see it. Her hands were still in her lap, and her shoulders were very straight, and she was staring at the centerpiece on the table, a small arrangement of white flowers that someone had chosen without knowing what this night was going to become. I stood up. I walked around the table to her, and I put my hand on her shoulder, and she turned and buried her face against my side the way she used to when she was small and the world had been too large and too hard. I just held her. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying. Colton had not spoken. When I looked up, he was gone. The legal process took 7 months. Westbrook Capital Partners was dissolved by court order. The fraudulent transfer claim was thrown out. There was a civil settlement. The terms are confidential, but I will tell you that it required Colton to repay both loans in full, with interest, within 90 days. He complied. The marriage lasted another 4 months after that night. Elise filed the papers herself on a Tuesday morning in February without telling me in advance. She called me after. She didn't say much, just, "It's done, Dad." And I said, "Okay, sweetheart." And we stayed on the phone together in silence for a while, just breathing. She's doing better now. She's moved back to Akron, renting an apartment about 2 miles from the house. She has dinner with me on Sundays. Last week she brought a casserole, and we ate it at the kitchen table and talked about nothing important for 3 hours. And I thought, this is what I was protecting. Al has been running the shop floor for me more and more these days. I still come in most mornings. I stand in the doorway sometimes, and I watch the floor, the saws running, the wood stacking up clean and square, the smell of sawdust and machine oil that has been the smell of my working life for nearly 4 decades. And I think about what Patricia used to say, that I was building something that would outlast us both. She was right. It will. There are things I wish had gone differently. I wish Elise had known sooner what kind of man she had married. I wish I had said something, that first handshake, instead of filing it away. I wish my wife had been at that birthday dinner, because she would have read Colton in about 45 seconds, and she would have said something to me in the car on the way home that would have saved us years of trouble. But I also know that there are things you cannot shortcut. There are things that have to run their course, and your only job is to be ready when they do. I was ready. The envelope was ready. And Callahan Woodcraft is still standing, exactly where I left it, exactly where I intended to stay. I still think about that envelope sometimes. The weight of it against my chest all day. The way I kept reaching up to touch it through the fabric of my blazer just to make sure it was still there. People have asked me since, friends, my brother, even Al from the shop floor, whether I felt satisfaction when Colton's face went white, whether that moment was everything I'd been waiting for. And honestly, I'm not sure satisfaction is the right word. What I felt was closer to grief. Grief that it had come to that. Grief that the man sitting across from me at my own birthday dinner had looked at everything I'd spent 38 years building and seen nothing but a number he wanted for himself. But here's what I've come to understand, sitting with it over these past months. What happened that night wasn't really about Colton. Colton was just the instrument. What that night revealed was whether I had built something that could withstand pressure. Not just the company, but myself. Whether the years I had spent making careful decisions, thinking 2 and 3 moves ahead, honoring the people who depended on me, whether all of that had made me into someone who could hold steady when it mattered most. I think about my father sometimes when I'm standing on the shop floor in the early morning. He was a machinist, worked the same job for 31 years. He used to say that a man's character isn't something he builds in a crisis. It's something he's been building the whole time, and the crisis just shows you what's already there. I didn't fully understand that when I was young. I understand it now. The trust that protected Callahan Woodcraft didn't appear the night of my birthday party. Janet and I set it up 14 years ago on a Tuesday afternoon with no drama, no audience, no applause. Just good judgment applied quietly over time. That's how most of the important things get done, I've found. Not in the loud moments. In the ordinary ones, when you're paying attention and doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. And Elise. I keep coming back to Elise. She filed those divorce papers herself on a Tuesday morning in February, without calling me first. That took something real. It took the kind of clear-eyed courage that doesn't make noise, the kind that costs you something and you do it anyway because you know it's right. I'd like to think she learned some of that from watching her mother. I'd like to think she learned some of it from watching me. Either way, it was hers. She earned it. The hardest part of getting older, I think, is learning the difference between holding on and holding firm. Holding on is fear. Holding firm is something else entirely. It's knowing what you built, knowing why you built it, and being willing to defend it, not with your fists, not with your voice, but with the quiet, unshakable fact of who you are and what you've done. Colton counted on me being tired. He counted on me wanting peace more than I wanted what was right. He miscalculated, because he never understood that for a man who has worked with his hands his whole life, peace and integrity are not two different things. The sawdust is still in the air at Callahan Woodcraft every morning. The floor crew still shows up before 7, and I still come in most days and stand in the doorway for a minute before I do anything else, just to breathe it in. That's not nothing, that's everything.